first of all, I'd like to start off with some acknowledgements. And I have used a couple of pattern book pictures or parts thereof. Jerry Pierce some years ago provided a lot of registration information, and various people have provided pictures. I'd like to start off with a quick overview. A lot of you will have seen this picture, and if any of you ever want to use it, contact me. But it just shows the proprietors, and the thing I want to get from this is that there were overlaps in proprietors. There weren't very sudden transitions. The only really sudden one was after James Wildman closed his earthenware factory and Shelley's opened a new one, and they started it from afresh. They didn't use any of his patterns and so on, but the rest of the people continued on with patterns and so on. I'll mostly be talking about the earthenware works, mainly because that's what we know most about. But I will also talk about the pottery in the early days, what we do know about it. Now, I'm starting off with the ware. I know most people will know where Stoke-on-Trent is, but it's in the Stoke-on-Trent district, and it was in an area called the Foley, after some people who had a large area of land there near the village of Lane End. And when the pottery started, it was these were very small villages. They're now, of course, all part of the greater Stoke-on-Trent area. Well, have a look at why Staffordshire became a major pottery centre, because it had clay for making earthenware. And when pottery started making china, they brought china in from other parts of the UK. It had coal, it had silica, which could be ground up, or flint, and it was added to earthenware clay to improve strength during firing so that the pieces didn't collapse. And adequate transport, which was important. If your pottery's fairly bulky and heavy, a lot of it, and there was an industrial canal and then the railways. And by 1860, about 60% of the UK pottery industry was in Staffordshire. Now, in 1822, Elkin, Knight and Company was formed and set up a pottery. And there was George Elkin, the older brother, his younger brother only by a few years, Thomas Elkin, and John King Knight, a brother-in-law. And they ran the pottery for the first few years. And the sorts of things they made, as did a lot of the other Staffordshire potteries, was blue transfer ware. But they also made some surface patterned green glazed wares. There's another couple of examples of their green glazed. They made willow pattern, and that was made by nearly all the proprietors right through to J.F. Wildman. They made some more blue transfer wares. This one was called Rock Cartouche because the names of the places or the names of the scenes were shown in a rock on the back of the plates. This one has a stamped eagle holding 3 arrows. I do not know why, but whether it was to be more attractive to the American market, but it was used variously by the proprietors on some wares, not all wares. They made 12 views called Irish scenery, and a lot of these seem to have gone to Ireland. And I don't know whether they used all 12. I'm sure the plates would have been, well, they were engraved by a London plate maker. There's the stamp. You'll see that it has Elkins and Company at the bottom of the stamp with the lion and the unicorn, and they were the plate makers. Warren was the merchant in Ireland that seemed to have got a lot of these wares. And this one, Stackpole Court, has the impressed eagle. And you can see there's 9 scenes attributed to Elkin, Knight and Company. Not ours, I hastily assure you. We only have a couple, but this came from the internet. In 1826, John Bridgewood was added to the partnership. Now, the Bridgewoods were a pottery family. I don't know whether he brought expertise, but more likely he paid for a partnership, and he remained with them for some years. At this stage, we do know a little bit about the pottery. In a history of Staffordshire potteries, it said the manufacture of Messrs. Elkin, Knight and Bridgewood is a new and very complete establishment, having in addition to the customary buildings a powerful steam engine and flint mill, and the ground flint was added to improve clay strength and adhesion of glazes. They used marks of EKB and occasionally EK and B. And the sort of wares they made are shown here, again, blue transfer ware. And they had an Elkin, Knight and Company impress, which shows that the plate was made before Bridgewood joined and decorated afterwards. British Palaces. The name implies a series. This is the only one I've been able to find. And Chinese fountains, Chinese Oriental influence was quite big at that stage. And a pattern called Etruscan, which had a few different centres, and it continued in use with various proprietors for some years. And they were also printing in a dark reddy brown colour, so not just blue transfer wares. When one of the oldest Elkin retired, Knight seems to become more prominent because his name appears first in the titles, and they used KEB and KE and B. Here's a typical cup from the time. They were doing some coloured wares then, hand colouring, and you'll notice that that's one of those very deep saucers. At the time, it was permissible to pour your tea into the saucer to speed up cooling and then drink from the saucer. A moss rose jug, and you'll see how they achieved the pattern detail with a whole lot of little dots. And one called The Call of Samuel from a biblical series. And you'll see it's a very detailed and well-executed engraved plate, a detailed pattern. Bridgewood retired in 1835, which left John King Knight and George Elkin, and George Elkin retired in 1847, so a brief look at that period. They registered one design. I've never been able to find an example, but presume baronial halls implies a series, so there may be more. If anyone has one, I'd love to get a picture. Pennsylvania, which possibly was made for the American market, but it shows romantic scenes or people in boats in front of pretty grand houses. Milan. And you'll notice that in the back stamp or the impress, they're calling their china, their earthenware, feldspar china, which is a bit of a misnomer, but they've glazed it white, and perhaps they were implying it was something better than it was. And this back stamp includes Foley, the first time they've included the name in a back stamp as far as I can find. A shaving mug from the wide base, same pattern, and a very large teapot. It holds 1.6 pints. I tried it yesterday, and which is about, 1.6 litres, which is about 2.6 pints. So it's a big teapot. And a few more on the same pattern. The plate on the right's a bit brown, so it's got a bit of hardware, probably with meat or gravy or something on it. And now they're calling it, instead of feldspar china, they're calling it ironstone china. And a cup with a bit more modern, to our eyes, handle. Hannibal Crossing the Alps was another series that they made for some years and which was revived by Wildman. Now, for a few years, John King Knight became the sole proprietor. We know a bit about him. In the 1851 census, he was a fairly prosperous man with a colliery and a farm, and his interest in, his Foley Potteries business. And some of his stamps, he used his initials JK, he used JK Knight, and again Foley Potteries, and he also used IK Knight. Now, I don't know whether this was a mistake of the plate engraver or whether I seems to have been interchangeable with J to some extent. Knight, after a few years, brought in Henry Wildman now, and they used K and W, and Knight and Wildman are the two back stamps I've been able to find. We know a bit about him, and I've included this because he had a son, Joseph, and Joseph Knight's back stamp caused me a bit of confusion when I was trying to sort out who made what. I thought for a while it might be his father, but he claims to have worked for Knight and Elkin, and he's setting up in the old Foley Potteries, which eventually became James Kent. And in a Staffordshire advertiser note, it would appear he had a difference of opinion with Henry Wildman, and Henry Wildman charged him with assault, which possibly is why he left the company as an employee. John King Knight retired in 1856, and that left Henry Wildman as sole proprietor. And this is where the Wildman's family really got involved. We do know a bit about him too. He was a prosperous-looking gentleman in his old age anyway. He married a lady from Hinckley in 1819, had 7 children, fairly prolific. He was a glass and pottery dealer in Paddington before he joined Knight. He owned another pottery with 50 employees, which was a pretty small one in those days. He added the Foley China Works, and he was chairman of the earthenware manufacturers. And he died somewhat unexpectedly in 1864. He used a back stamp of H. Wildman and also HW. This is Etruscan continuing on as a pattern. He died in 1864, and for a brief period, 2 of his sons who'd worked in the pottery became proprietors. James Frederick and Charles John, and they used marks of J and CW. And here's a jug in multicolours, hand-coloured. And they used, again, J and CW. You'll notice they're calling their product now not some sort of China, but Indian stone. And here's another example. It's got an impressed back stamp as well as a patterned back stamp, a printed back stamp. And you'll notice that they have written Indian across the middle of the shield. So presumably for Indian stone. Why Indian, I do not know. In 1866, they divided the business. And then in 1870, Charles retired. And I think that was on the grounds of ill health, but I've not established that. So now looking just at the earthenware works, James ran the earthenware works until he retired. That seems to have been his main interest. And it was certainly a much bigger business at that stage than the China business. We know a bit about him too. Where he's married, 5 children. One of them was called an imbecile in one of the censuses. So obviously didn't worry about people's sensibilities to the same extent as we do now. And he lived through to 1900. He had a lot of important positions. I won't go through them all. But in the 1881 census, he's a JP, manufacturer of china and earthenware, employing about 1,000 people, which would include both the china and the earthenware works. He used impresses, and again with the eagle. Why the eagle? I don't know. Variously used his initials and his surname, and his first and surname. We can identify some shapes by date. He rarely named his shapes, but his patterns were mostly named. But there's a shape that was registered in 1869. I haven't ever found an example, so if anyone has one, I'd be delighted to have a picture. Sexagon was a registered pattern in 1871. And the hieroglyphics in the cartouche in the top right were put on for a British merchant who had an agency in Java, and these were sent to Java. They are also on a few other patterns. Ceylon, the registered pattern picture is on the left, thanks to Jerry. The actual pattern and registration is on the right. And in the right-hand picture, they have replaced the centre with Sexagon centre, but are still calling it Ceylon and using the Ceylon registration number. Flower sprays, 1879, again a hand-coloured pattern. And swallow. Some of these also appeared in monochrome as well as colour. An 1881 advertisement lists them as china and earthenware, and 2 offices and showrooms, one for home trade, one for foreign trade. And this is an enlargement of all the what they called the merchants. And there's 14 listed there, which is quite an impressive list, but does not include Australia. I throw this one in because it would appear that they bought in teapots and jugs and sugar bowls or sugar boxes, in these large boxes. But this was registered by Blair and Company, and it appears with the Blair registration. So I assume they bought them in, but they may have come to some arrangement with Blair and Company to take over the manufacture of them. A Royal Jubilee plate from 1887. In 1888, they registered some shapes, and here's a couple of examples of them. And there were a number of patterns which came as series. Sporting scenes, which all show game, dogs, in one case a fox, and in some other pictures, some stags, and there's the other 4 to make up the 10 known scenes. Seasons, which appeared in monochrome and in colour, and there are 4 seasons. Picture top left shows spring and planting the harvest. The next one is summer, harvesting it. Autumn, bottom left, bringing in the hay, and obviously winter. They made a Rhine series, which were used by a number of other potteries as well. So they're obviously bought in patterns. They're all the same, a little bit the same as the old Pennsylvania from some years back, but they show romantic scenes of people in boats in the foreground, a river, presumably the Rhine, and some large buildings in the background. Lake sceneries was restricted to British scenes, and they were named in the actual scene, as you can see there, and they're all in the same surround, and there were 10 of them, and there's the other 10. I presume Eton College is a bit larger than the picture top right by now. One of the few named shapes, this was called Richelieu, and the cup in the left, top left, is not dissimilar to the Carlton cup shape that Wildman and Company and Shelley used later. A few continued and recycled patterns. Hannibal crossing the Alps appears again, but I don't know whether it's just that the plate on the right's smaller, but or whether they had the plate re-engraved, but it doesn't seem to be as good quality as the one on the left. Etruscan was another one that kept going. They're still making the traditional willow pattern. This one, British Palisades, you remember that there was a jug I showed you back from Elkin Knight and Bridgewood, which had the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. And this one shows hardly a palace, but it turns out to be, on investigation, a summer house that was on the Windsor Lake. A few other examples which are a bit different. This one with brightly coloured surround, and on the right, an oriental pattern. I don't know whether the left's particularly oriental. In a completely different style, some patterns where they used very large infill brush strokes. And this is with an impress. Albert and Victoria, which were pretty popular, or who were pretty popular, and I guess that's why they made them. The only difference, real main difference, is the bird in the little cartouche down on the right on the Victoria plate. Stag. I'm going through these fairly quickly because there's that many more. Some Oriental influences. The plate on the right's about the best decorated one we have by James Wildman. It has quite a bit of gilding and it's been very nicely coloured. I made various cup sizes, mammoth on the left top, and a child, right down to a child's cup and saucer on the bottom right. Some jugs. Most of these are from toilet sets. Children's wear. That's the children's cup we saw. They also made some plates, some with alphabet, some coloured, some just in monochrome. They made toilet sets. This is a composite of some we own and some the Proprietors owned. And the Proprietors was in a blue pattern, so I was forced to change the colour to match. The bottom right is a razor box for keeping razors in a passion flower pattern. A few tablewares, including a small mould, which is pretty crude, and the curved dishes on the bottom right are bone dishes, which went alongside the main dish when meals with bones were served up, and after you cleaned off the bones, you could put the bones on those little plates. And that was the end of James Wildman. He sold off his plant, retired. He sold 4 tons of copper plates, which is a lot. And some of these patterns appear on wares later made by other potteries who presumably bought the plates, and can be a bit confusing if you're looking for James Wildman by pattern name. Now, I'll go a little bit further with earthenware because in 1894, Wildman Company built their new earthenware works and they started afresh. And they also redesigned the stamps into a uniform style. They had the Foley china over the top of china. They were going to call most of their earthenware Foley, so they had the Foley faience over the earthenware pattern, a few high-fired pieces which were used in jelly molds and some kitchenwares and so on, were called semi-porcelain. And it looked, all their pottery was originally going to be called Foley, I think, which is why there's such a diverse range in called faience rather, which is why such a diverse range of wares in faience. And when Frederick Reed came along, he added some new ranges and gave them new names, and the faience stamp got revised so that faience got dropped out from the Foley above the logo and put underneath. But the old stamp continued, so you can't use that to date pieces. Now for a few words, not too many, about China. Henry Wildman added China works. We don't know anything about the first period. He took in Joseph Shelley, who'd been an employee as a traveller for Wildman and Company, for J.F. Wildman, and they set up a company called Wildman and Company to run the China works. 1881, Joseph's son Percy joined, and he became a major influence in Wildman and Company. And in 1884, he pulled out of the China works and left it with the Shelley family. And what they say about the early pottery is that for Wildman and Company is that it was ordinary, useful class for household purposes. And it was plain white china, some decorated with gold borders. So I presume that's why we don't have any examples. They're probably not easily identified, and they probably weren't particularly treasured, so they probably weren't kept. Now, Wildman and Company, when James Wildman was still there, registered their first design in 1880. And there's some examples. And you'll note that the little rondelles got used again many years later, 1916, as a variation of Cloisello, the white daisies on blue background. They registered a couple more patents in 1882. That's the earliest Wildman and Company teapot we know about that we can positively date. And these were identified only by registration marks, no logos. The identification of the diamond registration was obviously considered to be sufficient. Patent book started in 1882, and from then on we do know rather more about their patents. Some of those early registrations seem to have been given a patent number. For example, this is the first two entries in the patent book, painted green ivy. Now, I don't have an example that I can positively identify as that. And 3349 would appear to be one of the pieces from the Bird and Japonica registration, because it appears with a registration mark, and they didn't bother putting the patent number on these early pieces. They just had a registration mark. This one, we can tell a little bit more about some of the early wares, because there must have been a patent book before the first patent, which starts at 3348. And some of the entries contain a same as. And this is an example. This is patent 3593, but it says same as 1992. So presumably in that earlier book, this is what 1992 looked like. And the thistles are all gold. It's just the top one, the light has made it look black. This is the first example of a known backstamp for Wildman and Company, and it appears with the registration mark. That's the first Japan patent that they registered. And about a year later, they start using back stamps with the logo a bit more frequently, and they changed the crown. And some of these back stamps vary a bit. And I think what happened was that when the plate maker made the patent, he also engraved some back stamps. And since they would have been perhaps different patent makers, they ended up being slightly different. I add this one in because it's unusual in that it's a double registration. It was registered right at the end of the diamond mark system in December 1883, and in January, the Brits brought in a number system. And the number system gave protection for 5 years, so I presume that's why this was re-registered, because the diamond system only gave protection for 3 years. Now, I've thrown this in because this is that shape that is registered to Blair and Company, which James Wildman used, but Shelley, Wildman and Company also used it for their teapot and so on for some early patent wares, 1886. Now, just to finish off, in 1884, the China Works became completely owned by the Shelleys, and the son, Percy, which seems to be the driving force to improve their china. He went over to a Chicago exposition in 1893, and this little bamboo cup and saucer has a print of the exposition. Now, I don't know whether he took some samples along, and this is one of them, to show what they could do in the hope of getting business, or whether he tried to sell them at the fair, or quite what. But anyway, after he came back, he was convinced that they needed to greatly improve the quality of their china and the patterns. And this is one of the results was they recruited Frederick Reed as art director, and the china range was improved after that with new cup shapes and so on. Which brings me to the end of our talk, which is longer than most of them are, but anyway,